At Quite the Thing Media, we aim to bring you the best podcasts produced by independent creators, made without constraints.
This is Jacob from the Sunday Night Army podcast. Join the podcast father on his journey, sharing great things all sorts of creators are doing. He is the indie podcaster.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artists? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster with your host, the podcast father.
Here we are, another episode of Indie Podcaster. Thanks for listening, and thanks for telling a friend. I'm your host, Jeff, a.k.a. Podcast Father. Torch the Poets with me again. If he had a podcast called GOAT, it would stand for Going Off on a Tantrum, because that's what the Crow Show does. What's up, Torch?
What's up? I love it. I may have to steal that one. That might be a spinoff. Oh, man. I love it. I appreciate you having me here. Good old podcast father, the man, the myth, the legend himself. Y'all check me out, The Crow Show, better yet, on The Crow Show. And also, yes, we do go off on a tantrum. We love on each other. We're authentic. We're transparent. And we give it to you the way that you deserve to have it. You know, straight, no chasing. Check us out. And we talk about everything that is taboo every Thursday, 7 o'clock, Eastern Standard Time. In the evening, not the morning.
You'll be there in the morning, too, though, if they really want to.
You know it.
You'll be their crying shoulder.
Both. I got two. Lean on either one.
Today's interview we're going to share is a little bit different, but a good thing. I think I really like this interview because Nidhi Mehta is she's involved in so many different things. She's a Samsung content marketing. She's involved in that. Torch, I'll let you go through some more things she's involved in.
You know, podcast father, what caught me too is her love of pizza. Me being a Chicagoan, pizza and Italian beef, two staples of the Chicagoan. And any person who loves pizza, you get my vote, bottom line. And then being a dad of the world's most gorgeous daughter, she just made 21 3 days ago, you know, the Princess Bride, that certainly gets my heart as a dad. So that just pulls me in. And then as a writer myself, not to toot my own horn, but in Comp 1, I got 96%, and in Comp 2, I got 104%. So I love writing.
That's comprehension, Torch, not comped-in. You need to explain that to people.
Yeah, right. Right there. We're not throwing up no signs here. I just know you have to love anyone who has that gift to write, and she definitely has that gift. And, of course, she loves her family-oriented woman. But enough of me rambling on. I'll let you go ahead and pick up.
Yeah. What Torch is talking about are some things she goes through in the interview and actually a bio that she has out there. She's written for television in America and Europe. She's performed at Carolyn's on Broadway. She's helped several startups, different companies as far as branding go. She, like I said earlier, is involved in Samsung's content marketing. And actually, as far as podcast goes, and this is a podcast where we talk to a lot of different podcasters, she's written for 6 Minutes, which at the time she wrote for them was the most downloaded children's scripted podcast. Big, huge podcast that she's involved in. And that's just awesome from a writer standpoint.
I mean, that you have to marvel. You have to marvel. That's an accomplishment. Accomplishments, pardon me. Please, you'll have to tap in. It's a must.
Absolutely. Let's tap into this interview, man. But before we do that, let's take care of a little business.
You know how we do.
Jeff here. I want to talk about a few things that keep this podcast going. If you like the work that I'm doing, I encourage you to share it with a friend. That really is the best way to spread the word about Indie Podcaster. I would love it if you would go to your favorite podcast listening platform, may it be a Apple or Good Pods, and leave me a rating. Throw me some stars if you would like. All that word of mouth and sharing reviews of this podcast does help. This podcast and myself are a proud member of Quite the Thing Media. Quite the Thing Media, podcasts that speak to you. Go check out all the great independent creators from around the world. It is a community-based podcast network. Check it out. It's great. QuiteTheThingMedia.com. If you want to check out my page, it's QuiteTheThingMedia.com/podcastfather. You can request a review from me on site or submit a form to participate on this very podcast. Check it out. I highly encourage you to download and listen to your podcast on the Good Pods app. This app is awesome. You can see what your friends and influencers are listening to. They've got groups for all your interests. I've got 2 groups I highly suggest you check out. I've got the Indie Podcast group. I've also got the True Crime Obsession group. If you're an indie podcaster, Good Pods is for you. They've done crazy amount of things these last couple of months to reach out and help indie podcasters. They've got tip jars on there for your podcast. They've got performance charts that are based just on independent podcasts. Make sure you download the app and check it out. Podpage is a proud sponsor of this podcast. Podpage is an amazing resource to build your podcast website. You want them big search engine hits. You want to be out there. You want to leave your mark in the digital world. And this website makes it extremely easy to do that. You can set up your podcast website in just a few minutes. Make sure you check it out, podpage.com. That's enough of all that. Let's jump into this awesome interview. My guest today is Nidhi, and she is here to tell us about all the different things she has done and is doing. It is quite a decorative career that you've had. Welcome. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So we'll give you a few minutes just to talk about, introduce yourself. Before we started recording, you were telling me a little bit about your history, and I think everybody listening should definitely hear about how awesome it is.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So my name is Nidhi, and I am a writer / content manager. Currently, my full-time role is over at Samsung, and I do content marketing for them. And I also write scripted podcasts for children, which is doing really well, which is exciting. I've had a variety of jobs across the span of my career that have been varied from extremely creative and just steeped in the creative process to the more corporate end of things and back again. So I've really been able to explore writing from a number of different angles, and it's really helped me understand audience and get a really keen ear on how audiences take in content and what kind of drives them and what they connect to. So it's been cool.
I'm excited to get into it a little bit. So how did it all start? I mean, did this start after school, after education? I mean, what was the path and what was the beginning?
Yeah. So it started as a hobby. I was poised for medical school. I grew up thinking I was going to medical school. I was a pre-med bio major, but I loved television. I was writing from a very, very young age, single digits. I think at 8, I was starting to make up stories about princesses and dragons and things like that.
Right.
So writing was always something that I did. And I love the creative process in terms of bringing words to life on television. And so while I was studying as a pre-med bio major, I was also very, very involved in the campus television station. And so I ended up secretly, without telling my parents, picking up a minor in communication arts with a focus on television and script writing. And
were you worried they'd be mad at you or something? You said secretly.
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea was really medicine, and, working in television is something that seemed so far away and not a real thing that would happen to a normal little girl like me. So I guess for me, it was me hanging on to this secret dream that I had that I didn't know if it would be supported. And I should have known differently. My parents are extremely supportive people, but they like to know that there is a plan in place, which is, pretty smart, I guess. But I didn't have a plan with this. It was just one of those things where I'm like, maybe magically one day something will happen. But in the meantime, let me, focus on the thing that has a clear career path as well. And then write and understand the industry better, as a hobby and as like kind of a subtopic of, the big topic of my career. I weaseled my way into getting the school to allow me to take on an internship as a communications minor, which they didn't really do. You had to be a major and all of these things, but I had good grades and I was really active at the school station. So I kind of, talked my way into letting me take an internship at a television show. And it happened to be a soap opera. I had grown up from a very young age watching soap operas. You'd come home from school. That's kind of what was on. You watched it. You didn't tell your parents. So it was really exciting for me. I was like, this is kind of neat. It's in New York. I didn't have to go too far. So I took it. And my parents knew about the internship at that point. And I was like, it's just something fun. It's cool. I'm still doing well in all of my other classes. That's all they really cared about. And so I took on the internship and it kind of snowballed into, having people there who were really big supporters of me following my dreams and doing what I really wanted to do that I kind of didn't let myself believe I wanted to do. And so it was great because they were really supportive of me and they got me into a short program after graduation that was meant for like new graduates at the network. And it was basically it was getting an inside scoop on the television industry and like watching shows, trying to understand advertising and how advertising's targeted. All of that just snowballed into making the right connections, really. And in the year off that I was taking between undergrad and medical school, I ended up landing another internship at Guiding Light, which was a soap opera that was at the time, I think it may still be the longest running television show in history, I think. But it was pretty fantastic. I ended up landing an internship there. And it was right between the last few months of my year off. And I ended up getting a job offer there. I walked out of grad school orientation and went to them. And I'm like, they hadn't offered me a job at the time. I was just like, I walked into med school, or it was actually optometry school orientation. I walked into optometry school orientation and I just felt like this is not where I'm supposed to be. Like something was like, run for your life. And I listened to the calling. And so I ran back to the show and I was like, I know there's no plan in place. And I know I don't have, I know there are no positions here for me, but I just want you guys to know that this is what I just did. And I was in shock. They were in shock. My parents were in shock, but again, extremely supportive.
How scared were you?
I was really scared. I don't like not having a plan, which is why I ended up pivoting back to more of a corporate role at some point. They ended up creating a role and offering me a job. So that was pretty fantastic. And I ended up spending my 20s at Guiding Light. So very cool. I worked across the writing and production teams and I got a ton of experience. We worked a ton of hours and some of my closest friendships actually spawned from that work environment. It's still, to this day, one of the best decisions I ever made, one of the craziest decisions I ever made. But I've met some of the most amazing people to this date from working there. So that was wonderful.
Crazy and gutsy to just drop something that seems concrete to follow your heart. Yeah.
I was telling somebody who is now much younger than me just the other day that it's impressive how gutsy I was at a younger age and how I just had this faith that like things are going to fall into place and like nothing's set in stone and all of these things that I think you kind of lose as different responsibilities kick in. I'm a mother now, full-time job, all of those things. And you weigh all of your risks really differently. So I'm glad that I did it, glad that I took that risk. And it luckily paid off for me in a really interesting way. But once the show ended, soaps aren't faring well lately, although they are There is a little bit of a comeback happening, which is exciting, but they don't get half as much credit as they deserve. I think it's such a great training ground for any career you want to go into, because you work so hard and you work so fast, and you need to do the best you can with the little that you have, because there's like, the budgets are tiny, and it's long tape days. You're doing hundreds of pages of dialogue, in a week. I don't think anybody who works on a soap gets the credit that they deserve, which is you're just dealing with a lot of components and creating like getting 5 television shows taped and aired in the span of a week, usually. So, which is insane if you think about it. So it's such a great training ground, and the bond that you form with these people, because you're spending all of this time together for years on end. In many cases, they just become like family. I don't know if you watched the Friends reunion that was just on a few weeks ago, but
absolutely. Yes, I did. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. And it was one of those things where I think Matt Perry said something like, you would see another castmate at a party, and then like whoever you were with would not matter anymore. Like you would end up spending the rest of the party with that castmate. I feel that same way about if I saw any of the people that I, interacted with a great deal, or even some that I didn't interact with as much as I would have liked to back in the day. If I ran into any of them, like it wouldn't matter who I was with. Like it would be an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long conversation that we would fall back into. So again, just like a really cool experience. And I think being in creative environments really helps to breed that kind of connection. I don't necessarily feel like I had that kind of connection at some of the corporate jobs I was at. And so I think there's something just really beautiful about that as a byproduct of being a creative, like the community that you build.
And I think there is something to say about a lot of these soap operas, how long they've lasted. That takes a lot of creative twists and turns from a storytelling piece. What would a normal day on the job be like for you?
So it depended on which job I was doing. I started as an intern there, like I said, and then I ended up as a writer's assistant. I worked on the production team, and then I also had some episodes air on the show before it ended. But I also got to do a lot of different things at the same time. If I was in the writer's office and it was a day of the writer's meeting, it would be just like a lot of prep. And there's no place I love more than being in a writer's room, because people are like serious and getting down to work, but it's hard to not be silly and funny and have all sorts of emotions that you wouldn't necessarily like have at a job, because you're like so dedicated to these characters and the story and trying to figure out how it'll work. And like some ideas are ridiculous. And so you're viral off with different ideas and how ridiculous they may be just for the fun of it, or you get into how to make an idea as dramatic as humanly possible. So the few times that I got to hang out in the writer's room was really, really great for me. But from a production standpoint, if you were production coordinator on set, and if you were on location, your days would start somewhere at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. You'd be loading actors into a van and helping wardrobe. It's just trying to get all the pieces in place as a being on the lower budget end, I guess, and trying to get all the pieces in place was always a all hands on deck kind of thing. Yeah, we would pretty much span the range of, I don't even know how to put this because it feels like it was so much at one time. But if we were on set, if we were on location and on set as opposed to in the studio, it was just a really like all hands on deck kind of job where you were, 1 minute you'd be making sure lunches were ordered and set up. And the next minute you'd be making sure you were getting like actors to the right place on set on time, staying close to the producer of the day, making sure that they were set with their jobs. It was just very immersive, I guess, is the best way to put it, because I don't think I can properly explain what a day on set on location was like, because we were doing so much in one day, but it was incredibly immersive. And as somebody who loved writing, and working on the production end, it was really interesting to watch how all of those pieces came into play. And then like what we couldn't do because of budget, like what couldn't we pull off from the page, and how we would have to pivot and still make a scene work. Like that kind of stuff to me was magic, because you're in it, you're in the moment, and you have really specific restraints, but you want to make the product the best possible under those restraints. And so that's where people were putting their heads together and figuring out what could work, what could we utilize? Like, do we have another area that we can go to or use a different set? Or, I mean, just a number of different things could go wrong, and trying to problem solve in the minute, I think, was incredibly helpful to having a mentality and going forward in any other, job that I've had of, okay, if plan A, B, and C are not going to work, like, how do we pivot to still reach our goal or come as close as possible with what we have? And I think that was a great life lesson and a great work lesson.
Sounds like without a doubt, it would, even though you said that before, you really wanted to always make sure you had a plan, and I'm sure you're an organized person, but it sounds like it would make you that much more of an organized person.
Yeah, it definitely taught you how to prepare and about things that you would not necessarily think about. We were shooting in Orlando at one point, and it was something silly. Like, again, I have a writer's mentality, and like it probably drove the producers wild, and they were so lovely with me anyway. But I, like little things, like we're on set in Orlando and it's super hot and we have 10 minutes between takes. Like, do we have big umbrellas to put over our actors' heads so they can get a break from the sun? Like little things like that reminded me going forward to just think, not stop thinking. Like, don't be on autopilot. That's the worst thing that you could possibly do, is be on autopilot and just do what you plan to do for the day. And it just makes you realize, like, it's great to have a plan in place, but you should also know what your resources are at hand should things not go to plan, or should you realize a need within the plan that you didn't, identify beforehand. It was definitely a necessary step for me in my learning to move into even a corporate career where you're managing from a very different aspect, and it's not as creative. You may be managing creatives, which was what, my job has been. Usually it's managing creatives and managing creative strategy, but it helps you ask the right questions. It helps you come up with a plan on the spot when an executive doesn't necessarily like the plan in place or that you're pitching. And so I think in terms of helping me identify a different way to utilize my creativity other than writing, like that's what that production life gave me. I don't know that I always succeeded, right? Because I wasn't production minded going in. I was writer minded or writing minded. And so that experience was really tough on me. I always think of that Dr. Seuss quote that I will misquote, but it's like, you can't expect a fish to fly, right? I definitely misquoted that 100%, but you get my drift. But it was definitely a fish out of water environment for me, doubly, because I never really believed I would end up in television. And then I did, and I was grateful for that. And I never in a million years thought I'd end up on the production end. I was grateful that people were patient and were excited to help me learn. And I do think I learned a lot. And so it just prepared me that much more going forward of like, you may have a plan in place, but be okay with it not going the way you expected, which kind of prepared me for the rest of my life, personally and professionally.
I'm proud to announce that the podcast father, myself, Jeff, and Podpage are teaming up for this sponsorship. Podpage is great, guys. Like I was telling you earlier, it is so critical to have an actual podcast website. I know the link trees are used a lot, but you need an actual website. You need something that's going to show up in Google. You need something that's going to show some hits, a trail that will lead to your podcast. And there's not a better way to do it than Podpage. You can build a beautiful podcast website in 5 minutes. Automatically create a listener-friendly podcast site from your RSS feed. Customize the design to create a professional look you'll be proud of in just a few clicks. There is no coding or technical knowledge necessary. There's a free trial to give this a shot, and there's different packages ranging from free to all the goods and gadgets, but still at affordable prices. Podpage is big supporters of indie podcasts, so make sure you support them also. Go on podpage.com and get your podcast website set up. With that being said, we will roll into this segment sponsored by Podpage, where we will play a trailer from a different indie podcast every episode. I hope you enjoy it and give them a listen after you're done listening to my show. Then afterwards, we'll jump back into the interview.
Hey, it's Dan from the Pop Culture Hootenanny Podcast, and I just want to give you a little intro breakdown of what our show is. We're kind of a movie review podcast. We talk about random nonsense that comes up from the backstories, behind-the-scenes stories, and whatever else we want to talk about during our episodes. Here's a few clips to check us out.
Why do we cheer on, and this is a question for what we can discuss right now, why do we cheer on sociopaths in movies where we know that they're doing wrong in almost every single way?
Because we like the hijinks that ensue.
Because we like the hijinks that ensues, right?
Art and Tony. Yeah.
They're the best written characters. Right? You know what I mean? Like, she's trying to make amends and saying the kids would love to have you over, and I would love to have you over. And then as soon as he gets that okay, he just starts digging into the fact that she changed her name, right? And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. This is the 80s. Changing your name in the 80s is kind of a big statement.
We have so many jaded tropes in our head. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are certain movies that will try to make something look serious. And for a younger generation, it might be their version of, let's say, Arnold calling out the Predator.
1, 2, 3, 4, pop culture, hootenanny, pop culture, hootenanny, pop culture, hootenanny, pop culture, hootenanny.
How did you branch out, and then what was next?
Yeah, so I branched out by mistake / out of desperation. And
desperation? What do you mean?
Yeah, so the show had ended, and a lot of my colleagues ended up moving out west or started to kind of move out west because, you know, the television industry is much healthier out there. I guess not healthier. That's not the right word. There's more opportunities from a television industry perspective out west. And so a lot of my colleagues started moving out west. I was having trouble finding another job in television because the options were pretty slim, and a lot of soaps were going off the air around the same time. We may have been the only ones that year, but there was a lot of talk and a lot of prep for shows that were, about to go off the air. And so it was a couple of things. I was tired. We worked crazy, crazy hours. I didn't want to move out west. I was not ready at that time to make that jump. And I thought maybe I'd go back to school. I still had a love for healthcare. I still had a love for helping people. And I continue to have that love, like a very, very deep desire to help others. I was thinking that maybe I would get my PhD in clinical psych. It's something that I'd always toyed with. Even when I was undergrad, I thought maybe I would go that route instead of medical school. But it's just something that never came to fruition. And I didn't think too much about it. But now I had the time to think. We had a few months between when we were told the show was going off the air and when it did go off the air. And so I had time to actually think about what I wanted to do. Basically, I had applied for a clinical psych program. I had gotten in, but I had almost a full year, I think, or the majority of a year before it started. And so I still had time on my hands, and I don't like not making money. So I was like, I need a job. My friend worked at one of the big banks, and she was like, listen, I work on the creative side of finance. We hire a contractor 8 months out of the year. And the one that we just hired is no longer going to be available for the rest of her contract. Can you do X, Y, and Z? And I was like, yeah, with my eyes closed, because a lot of it was event planning. And that to me fell back in line with production, knowing like being prepared for anything, all the fine details, all those things. I'm like, yeah, I can certainly do that. And then part of that was content, because it was a lot of writing that would support these events, basically, to put simply. And so I was like, yeah, I can give it a shot. I'm pretty sure I can do it. And so I did. And I ended up doing much better there than I expected, in terms of like, I thought it would take more. I heard that, it was a really difficult department to work for. There was just like a lot of details, and everything needs to be perfect all the time. And you needed to make smart and fast decisions. And I was like, well, that sounds scary. Cool. Let's do it. And it ended up going really well, but I wasn't doing as much content as I would have liked. And so my boss ended up taking to me quite nicely, which was nice, because she is very good at what she does. And she wants everybody that works for her to be very good at what they do, or not wants, expects. And so I knew she was a hard person to please. So it made me happy that she, had that kind of faith in me, where she knew that they wouldn't necessarily be able to extend my contract. So she started to like look for jobs for me, which was amazing. And then that kind of skyrocketed that path. And I ended up going to another bank and working on their comms team. I was again like utilizing both sides of my brain with the writing, and not really just events, but just everything PR related. And to me, it was a great learning experience, but I wasn't really fulfilled. And luckily during that time, somebody I had met at Guiding Light asked if I wanted to work on a show that would be airing on Disney Italia. And it was more of like a creative thing. And it was something I could do while continuing to work at the bank. So I said yes. And so I was able to work on this like kids show that ended up airing on Disney Italia for a season. But it was just like a cool experience, and it helped me balance that corporate and creative. And I realized how much I needed that pure creativity in my life at a constant rate. So I started freelancing. I started working for what was then called Classtivity and now is known as ClassPass. And I would write their blogs for them and do that on the side. And then if you fast forward, I ended up leaving that bank because I really knew I needed something else. I needed something that would like really bond my creative side and my production side. I'm not sure if you want to call it my production side, but like my writing and strategy is really what I wanted to find a way to bond together. And I realized that most of my experience on the strategy standpoint was self-taught. And I didn't think that was sufficient enough, at least not for me. I need formal education. There's so many people who are really good at like learning on the fly and then being able to execute really strongly and being really keen on strategy and practices. And I just wasn't that person. I'm not that person. So I left the bank and I went back to school and I got my MBA, but it was again focused on entertainment and marketing and technology. This is a very long story, but it's kind of how I kept going and found a really great niche, which was after graduating, a little while after graduating, because I became a mom between graduating and starting my job at Samsung. But I went to Samsung and worked on one of their B2B teams and was really able to marry both sides of my interest. And all the while doing that, my former head writer at Guiding Light, we'd been in touch, and he was working on creating these really cool podcasts for kids that were scripted. And he asked if I'd want to help write one of them. And I was like, yeah. So I ended up being a script writer on a few of the podcasts that he created, and then one other one that's based on a PBS show. And so that's what I did from 2017 to 2020 that really fueled my creativity and my writing while working at Samsung, which was really cool. I left Samsung for a short time and I actually just went back because I love the people there and they let me do really cool things.
It's crazy to have a role like that, then be able to do all these other creative things. So tell us more about the podcast that you were writing for and that process. It was 6 minutes, correct?
Yeah.
It's the scripted podcast, one of the most downloaded family scripted podcasts to date, maybe the most downloaded.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I think it is the most. Yeah. So my former head writer, Dave Kreisman, at Guiding Light, he started a company with a few other people called Gen Z Media. And he started it with this podcast called The Unexplainable Disappearance of Mars Patel. And I think their first season won like a Peabody, if I'm not mistaken. I need to fact check that, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Yeah. So he was sharing about that with me when I had contacted him about some other things. And he was like, yeah, he's like, I'd love if you checked it out. And it was great. It is great. And so I said to him, I'm like, if you ever, need an extra pair of hands to write, I need something creative always. And he was like, yeah, he's like, I might have some stuff. I'll let you know. And he, held true to his word. And I think it was right after I graduated in 2017 from my grad school program, he shared this idea that he and our who ended up being our head writer, Tom Casiello, they had about a girl who's found in the water off the shores of Alaska by a young family. And it revolves around the mystery of like who she is and where she came from. But it's a sci-fi adventure family podcast that's scripted. And at the heart of it really is the family. There were a little over 200 episodes of that show written. And that show was 6 minutes. But there were a little over 200 episodes of that show written. And I think I was a scriptwriter on maybe just under half of them. And it was one of the most fun experiences from a writing perspective. And I missed writing that family so much and those characters so much. Tom and Dave are so brilliant. And my co-writer, Marla, she's just phenomenal. It was just a great team to work with. And the characters were so well formed and the stories were just so heartfelt and funny and moving and perfect for, that preteen, tween, teen, young crowd. It was pretty cool. It also overlapped, like the start of writing that show also overlapped one of the most traumatic times in my life. And it was like we had this like little built-in family where I felt like they knew what was happening. The writing team, like Dave and Tom and Marla, knew what was happening in my life, maybe more than like some of my family members even did, because while like I was in the hospital while I was writing my first few episodes, and like I ended up giving preterm birth to my oldest child, and so it was like a really unbelievably scary time for me. And we spent a long, long time in the NICU. We were in the NICU for almost 5 months with her. And I was writing. I would sit by her bed and her bedside, and I would write. And it kind of helped me get through. So I just think again, to go back to that bond you form in like creative environments, I just think there's something really magical about it. And I think that's why part of me like refuses to be fully non-creative, if that makes sense. Like I need something immersive and that kind of community in my day-to-day from a work perspective as well.
It makes perfect sense. It's, who you are. And a lot of your work on this stuff's come on the side, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think your relationship with your coworkers and all that is probably what helped make it work. So talk to us more about the 6 minutes podcast. What on your creative side, if you had to go into specifics, what did that kind of unlock maybe that the television didn't?
So I think maybe the most obvious, which didn't seem obvious to me until, Dave said it to me, was the way that you write. You're writing for an audience that isn't seeing anything. And I was like, oh, right. Like, I can't have little descriptors like,
Yeah.
you see something fly across the room. No, you don't. You don't see anything fly across the room.
How long did it take to get used to that? I can't. Yeah, because now that I'm thinking about it, from television to audio, my goodness.
Yeah, it took a really long time, and I don't know if I ever nailed it. But what was great about our leader, I call them our leadership team because I'm in corporate mode at the moment. But what was great about like Dave and Tom and everybody was that they didn't let it slide necessarily, but they would edit and we would see what our edits were and we would learn how to make it work. Because what Dave said to me too was like, it's okay. Like you can also like write it the way you would write it for television and then go back and edit and like adjust things that needed adjusting that obviously wouldn't translate to something that was just audio. Dave's always been a really good teacher, so we were lucky in that. But it also made us really look at the length of what we were writing, dialogue, and then also alternating voices. So if we had a number of females, right, like in one scene, we had to make sure to say the character's name at the top of the scene, but if not, like at least a couple of times so that you knew who was talking. So it was things like that. Music played such an important role. Sound effects played such an important role. So like, I can't say enough about the production team. Everybody was just so, so good. And I think that those things were the hardest, like trying to convey emotion without realizing that we won't have facial expressions to get us through. I mean, that was not just a challenge to us, but a challenge for the actors. And we had young actors, like really young actors, and they just grew with every episode. I remember like listening to the first episode to the last episode, and I'm just like, God, they like, I don't know, they really know what they're doing. It was very impressive. But I think it takes a really strong team of people and a really solid understanding of who your characters are and what the story is to pull something off on audio.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's just, I'm impressed. I mean, they put out, Gen Z Media, like puts out such great stuff all the time. So I just feel really lucky to be a part of that little family and be able to do those things and learn from them, because it was constantly learning how to edit yourself, learning how to convey emotion. And that just makes you a better writer to be able to do it through the dialogue or try to do it through the dialogue. I don't know. That was a lot of it. That was a lot of the secret sauce, was just going back and editing.
Tell us what's next, what you're thinking about next as far as your next step in your creativity, your inner creativity.
My inner creativity. I'm working on a book. I'm querying the book right now to agents. So I'm working on a book that's a nonfiction book. I've also been speaking to some of the agents that I've been pitching this book out to, and sharing some of the fiction ideas I have. So some novel ideas that I have, and they are really interested in those. So I think a lot of writing books might be in my future. I don't know. I'm working on this one book, which again is a nonfiction, and it's very much based on everything that I went through the premature birth of my older child. And it goes into a lot of background and history and cultural norms and biases and expectations. But I'm a first generation Indian American. My parents are both from India. My dad came here in the late 60s for graduate school. My mom came here shortly thereafter. And so they've been here for quite some time now. And we have a very strong Indian American community that I was raised with. And so there are just a lot of expectations that I think are very normal to have had. Our parents came to this country with very little, close to nothing. My dad came here with $8 in his pocket, and they sacrificed so much for us. So they only wanted what was best. And what was best was, what kind of was a surefire hit almost in terms of careers and in terms of how one lives their life. And there was no roadmap back then. There was no internet. There was no crowdsourcing information. People were going on their gut. But as somebody who felt very different from the people around her, very loved, I need to include that. I was very loved and very supported, but very different. Most of the people who loved and supported me didn't know how to maybe support my views on life as an adult in terms of careers and relationships and things like that. So I felt like I was kind of forging my own path for a long time and trying to make those people who loved and supported me my entire life proud, but also do the things that I wanted to do, which you've heard a lot about today. And that was really difficult and really lonely. So I didn't do things the way most of the people that I knew were doing things. And so it was really lonely. But it also gave me a lot of, I cringe when I say this, but I feel stronger having gone through it when I went through it as a teenager and in my 20s. And when I was faced with going into preterm labor with my older child, it came after a really long battle of trying to have a child at all. And so it was pretty grueling and really scary. At day 3, one of the doctors had said to me, start planning her funeral. And that to me was heartbreaking and just unfathomable. And while I knew that very well may need to be the case, I refused to think about it then or accept it, because I decided I don't know how long I have her for. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to be with her as much as I can and love on her as hard as I can for whatever time I have. So the book is a lot about how my early rebellions set up, I call them rebellions, but they were kind of meek rebellions nonetheless, kind of set me up to go through what I felt was going to be the trial of my life. I just talked a lot.
It's amazing. It's incredible. And congratulations. And I think the big takeaway from this interview for me is your family ingrained in you hard work ethic. And you really started it out with that, and your drive, determination, and desire to continue to grow, not only as a creator, but a person, is what helped get you to where you are today.
I think that is a very good summary. Do you want to write the summary for my book? Because I'm having trouble.
I am no writer, but I would try to help you with whatever I could. So let me ask you this, though. For those listening, some of them may be wanting to get into this career path or these interests that you have. You've done so many. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to a creator starting out? Because there's going to be trials and tribulations, like you just said. So what advice do you have?
So I think what's really great and really hard about the age that we're living in now is that it is easier than ever to connect to people. So that's the great thing. I think you should look at work that you really like that's being created out there and study it, whether that's if it's film or television, watch a show 15 times, try to get a script from the show from online and analyze it and see where the beats are, learn the story and start practicing. And then connect to those people and say, hey, this is what I really like about the work you've done. This is what I noticed. Am I on point? Find a mentor. I think it really is it's not just about what you know. And people have been saying this forever, from before, even when I was a kid, but it's about who you know as well. I think we have the opportunity to expand the who we know so much more easily now because people are accessible, and creators, I think true creators that really value art and storytelling are really open to teaching, sharing, and collaborating. So I think that's the easy thing. So again, just look at the things you love, dissect them, practice them, study them, and then start reaching out. If you're in school and doing this, use your school. Your school has way more resources than you realize, probably, in terms of who's graduated, who your teachers are. People know people. So start asking questions. Don't be like me. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I was so afraid to ask questions because I never wanted to fully admit to myself what I really wanted out of life. And so don't be me. Don't do that. Ask the questions, admit what you want, share. And I feel like doors start opening up to you the more work you put into the things that you want. And so talk to people, practice. The hard part about it is that there are a lot of creative people out there, and people are using their platforms to distinguish themselves. And I think that's hard because it feels like it's competition. But I think a great thing that I've learned over the last few months, even at the course of this year, 2021 specifically, is that, again, people are really happy to collaborate with people who know what they're doing or who want to learn. There are people with huge platforms right now that need admins. Start as an admin. I worked my way up from the ground up, and I think that led me to have more experience and knowledge about things as I maneuvered. And so I really valued that, but that's not the only way to do it. Just be open and talk to people, research it, share what you're doing. You don't have to be perfect. Your script doesn't have to be perfect. Your creative on whatever, your reels on Instagram don't have to be perfect. They just have to be there, and start learning and get better. Just keep trying is a nice little summary of what I'm trying to say. Like, if you want to do something, do it poorly and then learn, and then do it better and then learn and do it even better. Just keep growing, and you're going to find your way there. And if you don't, you're going to find your way to something else that was more interesting that you never even thought of before.
Great advice. I really do appreciate you taking the time today to come on here and tell your story and share that advice with us. I look forward to seeing what you're up to in the future for sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we'll make sure definitely to keep in touch. And yeah, really, thank you.
Awesome. It was my pleasure.
Really do appreciate you listening to this episode and checking it out. I hope you continue to do so with the next. I hope you have an appreciation for what I'm trying to do here, highlight all the different things all sorts of different creators are doing. I hope you get behind me on that and continue to join me on my journey. I'm Podcast Father, the Indie Podcaster. See you next time.